Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Beyond Hell podcast. My name is Kevin Swartz, and I am a Bible scholar whose academic work focuses exclusively on the topic of hell. This podcast has been a long time in the making, and I thought that at first I should at least introduce myself, say a few words about who I am, including this podcast, my academic work, things I have written, things I've done, things I will do, etc. With that said, I do want to keep this episode brief. My goal here is to simply introduce the podcast, explain the topic or topics that we will be exploring, say a little bit about who I am, but give you a sense of why I think that this conversation matters. Now, the goal of this podcast is to explore the topic of hell carefully, honestly, and historically. It will not veer off into other theological or textual issues, but it will remain centrally and solely focused on the topic of hell. Now, I do want to be clear about something from the beginning, though. This podcast is not primarily theological in the sense of arguing for or against any particular doctrine. I'm not going to try to tell you what to believe. Instead, this is going to be different. It's going to be specifically historical and academic. We're going to ask questions like, what did ancient people mean when they used these specific words or phrases? What images would have come to mind when they heard these names read out loud? How did these ideas of postmortem punishment develop over time? And perhaps more importantly, how might the original audience understand these texts, and how does that differ from the assumptions that many people today bring to the text? Because for many people, the word hell carries a very specific image that generally includes a place of fire, punishment, torment, perhaps even a place of execution. But when we start going back to the earliest sources, we quickly discover that the picture is much more complex, and I think in much cases very, very different from what some later Christian traditions came to emphasize. This podcast will explore that gap. And yes, every episode will be about hell in some way, shape, or form. But it will also consist mostly of original content. I truly want that to be the focus of this podcast. However, from time to time, I may do an occasional response episode, but it'll typically only be towards, say, a scholar, theologian, pastor, or someone who should know better. But yes, there will be occasional response episodes, but I mainly want this to be a teaching and discussion podcast because for the past several years, my academic work has focused entirely on one topic: what the Bible actually meant when it used terms that are often translated or even understood as hell. My PhD research involves working within the cultural world of first century Judaism. In other words, this podcast grows out of not just personal interest that or things that I have wrestled with, but also comes out of a full-time research project for the last few years. Now, in this podcast, each episode will be obviously be different, but it will be organized topically, categorically. For example, we won't simply talk about terms like Gehenna, Hades, the lake of fire, Tartarus. We'll look at how Jesus and other biblical authors used these images rhetorically. We'll explore how later Christian interpreters understood, or in many cases, misunderstood these terms or what was being said. And along the way, we'll separate what the texts actually say from what later Christian tradition often assumed they said. Occasionally, we will also talk about other religions and maybe their views of hell, which might include Islam, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Mormonism, etc. But obviously, the vast bulk of this podcast will, of course, focus primarily on the Christian view of hell and the Christian theology of hell. Now, my goal is not to shock you or provoke you, but to invite you into the process of interpretation. Because I firmly believe that true academic research has a way of opening windows into the past that can completely change how these familiar texts can actually be seen. And when we see the historical world behind the words themselves, the text often becomes more profound and in many ways much, much more meaningful to us. Because, for example, if a word or phrase or expression that most think indicates hell did not originally mean hell for the original author, then we are the ones that are actually misusing the passage and forcing it to say something that it never originally intended to say. Because of that, I think it's really important to devote a good amount of time and research into this topic that scholarship has largely avoided for various reasons. Additionally, we will look at some of the more philosophical questions attached to hell. Um, Questions that plague both religious and non religious people alike. Questions such as, if God knew so many people were going to hell, why did he create hell to begin with? Questions such as those operate similar to what's called a thought experiment. And you may be surprised at how trying to answer those questions reveals what you think about that topic, and in this case, the topic of hell. Though we will explore those kind of philosophical concepts, my main focus is textual. My PhD is in biblical exposition, which focuses on methods and interpretation of the Bible. I wrote my dissertation on Gehenna, called Between the Valley of Hinnom and Hell, the rhetorical function of Gehenna, where I look at the historical location known as Gehenna and how its imagery and symbolism played a role in later New Testament authorship. More specifically, however, my dissertation focused on the New Testament's usage of Gehenna as an actual geographical location and not as an infernal underworld known as hell. Now, I know that may be slightly controversial, but after years of research and writing and time into this project, I think my dissertation demonstrates a level of plausibility, at least, that has yet to be examined within scholarship. And it's important to note, and I want to get this out there, that as a self identifying Christian, I am not trying to deny anything with my dissertation. I'm not trying to disprove, deny hell, divine justice, God's judgment on the wicked, none of it. I am simply saying Gehenna is not it. And now I've heard quite a few scholars over the years say something along the lines of Gehenna does not mean hell. Yet very, very few, if any, have actually taken the opportunity to write about it. So I took this opportunity to research it with the help of my PhD mentor, Dr. Jennifer Brown Jones, who was a tremendous blessing to my research. In fact, the first series of this podcast will be specifically on Gehenna, where I will take my dissertation, break it down into the biggest pieces of evidence that I think proves what I was trying to say, and present it in a way that everybody can understand. I'm not sure how many episodes that will be, but it'll be enough to really break it down enough to be clear and demonstrate my biggest points that I proved in there. Besides my PhD, I have a master's in theological studies and a bachelor's in pastoral ministry. My background within Christianity is quite extensive, having grown up in the church in the charismatic movement in the 1980s. So I'm sure you can imagine what that was like. But while still being fairly new to scholarship, I have participated in what is known as the conferences. Uh, every year, consisting of ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society, and SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, having presented at both, presented SBL twice. My first presentation was on a paper I wrote called Daniel 12:2 and the Threat of Shame, which eventually got published in the Journal of Old Testament Essays. And that's an open access journal, meaning anyone can find it for free on Google. It's not behind a firewall. I'm currently working on two books right now that are set to be published, hopefully within a year or so. Both are reworkings of my PhD dissertation. One is an academic version that is basically my dissertation in full, less a few technical aspects. The other is a trade volume, where I am essentially rewriting the whole thing for a wider, more general audience. But concerning this podcast specifically, I want it to be very accessible. Even though the research behind it may be academic, I want to present it in a way that anyone can follow, where you don't need to know Greek or Hebrew, you don't need a seminary degree. All you really need is curiosity, and I think more importantly, a willingness to explore with an open mind. Again, I have no theological agenda for this podcast. In fact, as I briefly alluded to earlier, I would like to keep this podcast free from theology and focus on other angles of hell, not really discussed much within religious circles. And that will be demonstrated in my next episode, my first full episode of this podcast, where we see how theology can sometimes act as a wall between us and the historical language used that often conveys the idea of what people think of as hell. Ultimately, though, this podcast is about understanding the past, understanding the text, and I think more importantly, understanding how ideas tend to develop over time. So, whether you're here because of personal interest, academic curiosity, or you've simply wondered about this topic, thank you for listening. I hope you'll follow along, and I hope you'll tune in next time. Thank you.